When I was about 12, my stepdad took me to some friends. They were Hakka people who worked with him at the Chinese restaurant. He was working his way through his PhD, and he had worked on restaurants since he had come to the US. Since he was fresh off the boat in LA, he wasn't able to speak English at that time, started to work in a Chinese restaurant. Then later in Colorado, he was working in Chinese restaurants. And that was kind of my first exposure into different Chinese communities, Taiwanese communities at that time. Because a lot of times there were the back of the restaurant where people would play mahjong, or there were illegal movies, kind of like if you went to a movie, they would already have that movie that was in the movie theaters on a VHS in the back, and you could buy it for $10. So this is just kind of, I guess, a shadow economy, you might say. But this is where I got the first videos. Wong Fei Hong, who's a kung fu guy who is based on a real person, who is a kung fu hero, who was a Chinese medicine doctor. So from the time I was about 11 or 12, I remember thinking, I'm definitely going to do this. I definitely want to learn kung fu really deeply and do Chinese medicine. So I asked him about doing Chinese medicine, and he said, yeah, sure, you can do it in the back of a Chinese restaurant, probably like bone setting, that kind of thing. But there was no concept that it could be a legitimate job. So most of my friends at this time were little Chinese kids whose parents were students or worked at Chinese restaurants. And I kind of pictured myself, working out of the back of one of these, low expectations. But again, I was 11 or 12, and my only point of reference for Chinese medicine was within the Chinese community. And it wasn't something that people would really even talk about. So they might be talking about Qigong or something like this, but if the pastor of the church came around, the conversation would shift pretty quickly. It was almost something like, if you talk about it, the foreigners will think that you're weird, or think that it's something spiritual, or they'll get weird about it. So it was a little bit tight-lipped as far as that was concerned. But on the other hand, I was able to see that it would have dramatic effects in, especially for gastrointestinal problems, in a way that Pepto-Bismol just did not. So I was seeing it as a very fast and effective medicine for bone setting, for gastrointestinal problems, and for other conditions that I wasn't used to seeing that from over-the-counter Western medicine. So I was very impressed by it, but I also had no concept that there was a future in it. So while I was in Chinese medicine school, I stopped at a Chinese restaurant. A friend of mine and I were studying. That's basically all we did. And we took a break to eat at this place because they had a deal, I think, every Tuesdays. They had a lunch special. So I went in there, and there's a kid in the back of the restaurant, and he seemed to be a little bit wiped out, a little bit sick. And these are the kind of, this kind of situation when I was a kid, we'd be back there probably studying or hanging out. So I went and, just asked them, hey, what's going on? And they said, oh, well, it's this boy's name was Sonny, and he had a severe headache, wasn't able to sleep. He felt sick. He had some delirium a little bit. I took his pulse, and it was just flooding, booming kind of pulse, a sign that there was excess buildup of gases like nitric oxide, which were causing vasodilation, cardiac contractility, a combination of these vasodilative gases, which also increase cardiac contractility, and the heat that was built up from the various microbes that had been kind of composting in his GI tract. So I asked, where is the headache? And they said, well, it's mainly on the forehead. And I touched his forehead. It was really hot. They said officially it was a low-grade fever that had been sustained over some days. So I asked them when the last time was that he had a bowel movement. And they talked to him in Cantonese, and he said it was 2 to 3 days ago. Okay, this is very likely the problem. And the formulas which are used for this type of headache, this type of fever in Chinese medicine, revolve around inducing bowel movements. I was thinking off the top of my head, okay, there are these formulas which I can use. Are they safe for a kid? They probably were, but I was also just right there. So I palpated his stomach, and as soon as I started to touch his lower abdomen, he groaned. There was pain there because there was so much pressure which had built up in that area. So I began to massage using counterclockwise circles. And I did that because this is considered an excess condition, and I wanted him to burp and fart and release some gases so that he could have a bowel movement. So he felt uneasy at first. I said, yeah, it's okay. This is normal. And eventually he got a burp. His eyes got really wide, and he kind of had a startled expression and said, I gotta go. And he ran to the bathroom. He was in there a while, doing what he needed to do. And after a lengthy bowel movement, he came out and he said he felt cool. He didn't feel hot anymore. His fever had been down. And this is just a very typical, we call Yang Fu syndrome in Chinese medicine. And for a kid, you might use something like Xiaocheng Qi Tang. But in this case, I used the idea of that and just used some simple abdominal massage. And his mom said something like, Hei ho isam, which I guess means like, hey, you're a good doctor. Again, I was just a student, but using the concepts of Chinese medicine, realizing that this kind of low-grade fever, which is, worse in the afternoon, associated with heat in the forehead, it wasn't so important that I used herbs or didn't use herbs. What was important was that I followed the overall strategy, and that ended up working really well. My cousin had a similar situation with her baby. Chodong is my cousin-in-law. Funny story about her. She was on a date with a guy on Omei Mountain, one of these holy mountains in China. And she had gone there I think it was a date. And there were monkeys there. And the locals know that you need to get sticks to beat those monkeys away because the monkeys will try to steal your food. Well, one of these monkeys came after her, and her boyfriend or the guy she was on a date with, was in between her and the monkey, but ran behind her, and the monkey went up and bit her leg and drew blood. It has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about, but it's kind of a funny story. So yeah, Chodong got bitten by a monkey. Sorry. Which was her first and last date with that guy. But anyway, she went on to marry a wonderful man, and they had a baby. Actually, they had some trouble getting pregnant because her husband's sperm had been irregular, and they went to see Jin Zhao, who's my herb teacher. And he said to them, well, we just need to clear out dampness. So he used a combination of some herbs as well as sanren tang in order to help to clean out the urogenital microbiome, and specifically the testes have their own microbiome. And when they get filled with the wrong kind of microbes, they begin to deform the sperm. So he used about a 3-month process to clean out everything in that area, and as a result, they were able to have a healthy girl. Now, over time, the girl got a fever, as all kids do. And what happened was, the baby had this really high fever. She didn't quite know what to do, but she touched the baby's stomach, and there was this kind of excess pressure that she felt in the stomach. And, she was messaging Lon and I saying, hey, what should we do? So we said, hey, just use some of the MicroGuard Plus. It's great for kids. It'll be fine. So she gave it to the kid, and after burping a little bit, the kid had a bowel movement, and afterwards the fever went away. So with kids, they can't really control the diet so much because it's supplied by the parents. And the digestive system, it's still a little bit weak. So they tend to get these diseases of food stagnation, this kind of dysbiosis caused by eating the wrong types of foods or at the wrong pace because, they might be really hungry because they're growing, so they overeat. That's fairly understandable. So when that happens in kids, we want to avoid the temptation to use really powerful herbs, really powerful antibiotics. And the first thing we need to look at is whether they're digesting appropriately. Because if they're digesting well, everything should go along just fine. If we're using herbs which have a strong antipyretic effect, we can really start to throw off their temperature regulation and their immune system. They're at a very delicate stage of development, so the first thing we want to do is make sure they're digesting efficiently. If all of that's working, then more often than not, the fever, the cold will go away on its own. This is true for most adults as well, but particularly true for children. So when you're working with children, if you see that they have a fever, especially a low fever that's worse in the afternoon, do what you can to get them to induce a bowel movement, and you'll notice that the fever will more likely than not resolve on its own very quickly. Thank you so much for listening to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. I am your sudoriferous host, Dr. Andrew Miles.